Thank you for joining us today to listen on Australia, the preferred destination for early phase clinical trials. My name is Renu Buller. I'm a partner and senior vice president for healthcare at Frost Sullivan. Frost Sullivan tracks the CRO market globally, and we've been doing that for the past 50 years. We work across 40 locations in the US, as well as China, Europe, and Asia Pacific. This white paper has been sponsored by Novotech, so thank you very much for their generous gesture. They are Australia's largest independent CRO, and they have offices throughout Asia Pacific, including here in China itself. They are full-service CRO, and they have significant experience in early phase clinical trials and fully quality endorsed as well. So to start with, let's look at the trend or the practice of outsourcing for CROs. The total CRO market has continued to grow at approximately 12.1% between 2025 to 2020. Frost & Sullivan estimates that this outsourcing market could be worth as much as $56 billion in the next 5 years or so. And the reasons why companies choose to outsource are very clear, I'm sure, to you, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. So when we look at pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, the number of companies that are actually doing R&D, especially early phase R&D in countries like China, has continued to grow. If we look at R&D spending, about $142 billion US dollars in 2015, 31.8% of that went to the CRO market. So approximately close to 30% was actually used for outsourcing to CROs. We project that the way companies are structured, it's more difficult today to also get human resources. It's extremely difficult to get experts that can actually run clinical trials quickly and efficiently, looking at various responsibilities from administration down to documentation as well. Many companies are looking towards CROs to enable them to do the clinical trial process much more efficiently. So based on that, we forecast that by 2020, in the R&D market landscape, 42% would actually be outsourced to CROs from a revenue perspective. So as I mentioned, why outsource to CROs? I think time to market today, whether it's time going to market or between phases from preclinical to phase 1 and phase 2 is crucial. With the industry becoming much more competitive, we find that companies need external expertise to support them in terms of an environment that's much more regulated and obviously much more risky. So when we look at smaller biotechnology companies, often human resources and capital is one of the issues that they need to work with. And so outsourcing is a faster way to ramp up. With the investment, as we talked about, and the regulatory processes, biotechnology companies that outsource to CROs are able to tap on their expertise. For large MNCs as well, outsourcing is something that they have adopted for more than a decade and find that it's a way to improve efficiency and scalability, especially as the number of molecules in the pipeline grow with mergers, acquisitions, JVs, and partnerships. We find that CROs used by MNCs help them to move much more quickly and efficiently. We've seen that here in China as well, as companies such as Lilly, for example, have numerous partnerships with smaller local biotechs, and because of that have multiple trials in early phases. Now, with the Asia-Pacific region, we see that many early-stage clinical trials have been done in US and Europe historically, and that's where the traditional market has been. India, for a very long time, was also a hub for clinical trials in Asia-Pacific. What we are seeing that in terms of global trial sites, Asia-Pacific has continued to be extremely important from a company perspective. Countries like Japan, China, Australia consistently feature in global trial sites. We have a large number of patients, so there's a large patient pool, and also we have an accessible patient pool that's treatment naive. Now, when we look at Australia, I think Australia has a unique advantage, especially for early phase clinical trials. The country sees more than 1,000 research projects done each year with more than $1 billion in terms of spending. We have many international biotech companies as well, US-based companies, for example, that have successfully conducted early phase clinical trials in Australia. And some of the reasons to do that is really, we'll show that Australia has an excellent process in terms of clinical trials. It has an excellent regulatory process that is transparent and actually time efficient, and on top of that, cost efficient. So what we did is we looked at why Australia is a preferred destination, especially for early stage clinical trials. The number of researchers that are available, high quality international researchers in Australia is virtually unmatched. So they also have a large pool of patients that they can work with. We spoke with different companies to understand as well why they were coming to Australia so that we could present some live case studies of outcomes around that. So earlier we looked at the global CRO market. Here we look at the Australian CRO market, and we see that is also growing at about 12%. It shows that as a market, clinical research is continuing to develop. It's got strength in clinical trials come in terms of the infrastructure that's there. It talked about the clinical researchers as well as the IP laws and the approval process. So when we look at where the increase has been in Australia in the number of trials, we see that the fastest growth has really been in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So for phase 1 trials, we've had an increase of more than 50% between 2010 to 2015, indicating that this is an area where companies are looking to develop early stage products. Similarly, phase 2 trials have grown by 25% from 145 trials in 2010 to 181 in 2015. The growth of trials in other phases are relatively a little bit slower, but where we see the advantage specifically for Australia is really in early stage clinical trials as well. Now, when we spoke to biotech companies in China and the US to understand why they were looking at Australia to outsource clinical trials, 3 key reasons came up as the main reasons for choice. Firstly was cost efficiencies. They found that it was much more cost efficient to conduct a clinical trial in Australia, an early stage trial, compared to the US. The second was regulatory speed and flexibility, which is extremely important, especially when you're looking at moving from phase to phase. And the third was the quality that they were getting from the Australian market itself. So we'll start by looking at the cost efficiencies. I think one of the key factors, not just from a cost perspective, but from an R&D perspective, is the Australian government is very focused in terms of attracting companies to do early stage research in Australia. So they have provided an R&D tax incentive where there is a 45% refundable R&D tax offset for companies with a turnover of less than 20 million Australian dollars. So we actually spoke to certain tax consultants in Australia as well, and we verified that the Australian R&D tax incentive is one of the best in the Asia-Pacific region, if not in the world. It really makes it attractive to biotech companies with smaller revenues because, as we know, because capital is not as easily available, we have to maximize as much as we can. There are countries that offer tax deductions, but I think this is one of the unique cases where there is actually a tax refund for offsets that are not used. Also, the process with which to get the refund is pretty transparent and efficient, and based on companies we've spoken to, we found that that can happen in a matter of few months. So it's not really waiting for a few years to get that refund back. So can a foreign corporation actually access the R&D tax benefits? Yes, so a foreign corporation can access R&D tax benefits if it conducts phase 1 clinical trials in Australia and fits the eligibility criteria. So it would have to be, have to undertake early stage R&D in Australia, and it covers most of the expenses that you need, which looks at salaries, overheads, as well as R&D depreciation and materials. There is a minimum spend of 20,000 Australian dollars on R&D expenditure, and if you actually contract to a registered research provider, that threshold is phased. So when we look at these cost efficiencies and the tax incentives as well, we found that we did a like-for-like comparison study for a company conducting an early stage clinical trial in the US and in Australia. So we put the index for the US, as you can see, at 100. So you have clinical, we broke down the different costs. You have clinical, data management, biostatistics, medical writing, investigator fees, and others. And what we did is we kind of converted the US index to 100. Now, without the tax benefits, we found that there was a 28% savings in terms of conducting the same trial in Australia. Specifically, that came from reduction in clinical. That was where we got the biggest reduction itself. And then some other reductions as well in the other areas like data management, biostats, and medical writing. Now, when we come to the next level, when we input the R&D tax incentive within that, we found that there is a 60% cost savings in terms of conducting early stage clinical trials in Australia as compared to the US. So this becomes, a significant savings, especially if you're going to conduct, whether it's one trial or more than one trial, you find that it provides certain flexibility and savings from a financial perspective. So in a specific case study, we found a US biotech company which conducted its early stage phase clinical trial in Australia was able to save up to US 1.8 million through these tax exemptions. So this was for a clinical trial. It was a 12-week study with 150 patients across the country to test a new treatment for obesity. Why was Australia actually chosen for this phase 2 study? There was an availability of participants, so you could actually recruit quickly for the trial, the fast and efficient regulatory environment, as well as the tax policies. So you can see that the R&D tax incentive was a significant benefit to companies conducting trials in Australia, especially smaller companies. So this allowed the company, if they had done the same trial in the US, it would have cost them 1.8 million US dollars to actually run that. Now, coming back to that, cost is one factor, but the second factor is really regulatory speed and flexibility. And the Australian regulations is well recognized internationally. It's got an excellent reputation, even in international, like in US with the FDA. So we find that companies that do clinical trials in Australia are able to progress pretty quickly because of that recognition. Now, in Australia, most commercially sponsored trials are conducted under the Clinical Trial Notification Scheme, and that actually reduces the regulatory burden on clinical trial sponsors. So what happens is there's a direct submission to the Institutional Ethics Committee at the request of the sponsor. They assess the validity of the trial design, safety and efficacy. They assess ethical acceptability, as well as approve the trial protocol. So it all happens in one place, and you get final site approval from there. The TGA, which is the Australian equivalent of the US FDA or the SFDA in China, does not need to review the data. It's all done by the Clinical Trial Notification Group. So the TGA just needs to be notified after the trial has actually received site approval. They may not necessarily actually review data, although they have the authority to audit and inquire on the management of the trial. The TGA does not need to review any data for the trial. So what this does is, you don't have duplication. You don't have one trial group and then the regulator reviewing the same data and giving approvals twice. So this actually helps us to save both time and money. So when we look at a US-based biotechnology company who did the early stage trial in the US, this is actually directly what they found. They'd done trials in the US as well as in Australia, and they found that contract negotiations, especially when working with academic institutions in the US, was a lot more difficult. So, they had challenges in terms of timelines, especially for startups. So this standardized regulatory framework actually helped the company to move much faster across the clinical trial process. So while the process is fast and efficient, it does not mean that there is a compromise on quality. What happens is, because the TGA is a recognized regulatory body, if you do a clinical trial in Australia, you do not require the FDA investigational new drug approval. However, the data from the studies that you conduct in Australia can be used to support international regulatory applications. So if you do the clinical trial in Australia, it is actually recognized by the FDA IND submission as well. So in that way, we have the cost savings, we have the flexibility, and we have the ability to use this internationally to enter the US as well. So because of that, you have the path to clinical is actually shorter, and you find that because the approval process is faster, you actually helps you in terms of gaining approval in other countries as well. So when we spoke, for example, to one of the companies in China, they said one of the main reasons most Chinese companies opt to do early phase clinical trials is because the time to get CFDA approval is much longer in China itself. In addition, the Australian government is now in the process of implementing further reforms. They want to look at how we can further reduce study times, support patient recruitment, as well as help standardize clinical trial costs. So with the focus the government has to ensure that Australia remains one of the leading destinations for early phase clinical trials, they've actually put in reforms as part of the national agenda. So firstly, what the government plans to do is publish standard costs for trials, which means you know what the trial would actually cost from a rough perspective. It will help you to draw up budgets. There are no unexpected surprises at the end. And it also helps you to reduce contract negotiations. So that standardization of costs, procedures, and time help you to see that you are not paying more, for example, that another company would pay for a similar type of trial. There is also improved coordination across the states, which means that if you were to do a trial across different sites in Australia, it gives you access to different sites, and you actually have mutual acceptance of review and ethical committees, so which means you don't have to do multiple reviews, to have multiple trial sites across the state. The third is also consumer awareness. As we know, there are concerns from consumers to participate in early stage trials because they think they're being used as guinea pigs. But the Australian government is supporting that. It has published a consumer guide to clinical trials. It's helped to educate consumers on the risks and benefits of clinical trials. So hence you have a lot more awareness and consumer willingness to participate in clinical trials, making patient recruitment easier. And finally, looking to enhance capabilities. While Australia already has a very large number of world-renowned sites, we have principal investigators and clinical and research scientists that are world-class, the government is still looking at nationally accredited and training courses for investigators and site personnel to ensure that that human resource supply, that skilled and trained human resource supply, is going to continue to be available in the country. So to give a specific real-life example of how regulatory speed and flexibility has supported a US pharmaceutical company to save time, this is an example of a company that was able to achieve rapid startup because of this simplified regulatory process in Australia. So it received protocol approval in 1.5 weeks from time of protocol submission. So that's kind of a record. It's like, you apply on Monday, and by next Wednesday, you actually have already received your approval. So this was actually a California-based pharma company. They had products in regenerative medicine and oncology, which are two areas where we're seeing a large number of research and early stage products being developed. They worked with Novotech to enroll 29 patients with androgenetic alopecia, so male pattern baldness, within 2 months. So in 2 months, we managed to get the number of patients required for the phase 1 clinical trial. Because we did not require the IND application prior to commencing phase 1 trials, the company could conduct it easily under the clinical trial notification scheme. Proposals were directly submitted. It received EG approval and notification from TGA, so process was very quick and simple. And because the trial was actually conducted at a private site, the medical center at which the trial was being conducted acted as the ethics committee. So it actually resulted in a much quicker time compared to a public site. So all of this, you have protocol approval in 1.5 weeks, you have 29 patients in 2 months. It's one of the fastest timelines to conduct a phase 1 clinical trial anywhere in the world. A second example is for a US company that was able to run a phase 1B clinical trial at the same time as a phase 1A first-in-human clinical trial. And with that, it supported the company in revising the dosing schedule for its phase 1 oncology studies. So here the company actually was conducting clinical studies in 3 different types of cancers. And as you can see, they were able to recruit between 32 to 56 patients across 6 to 7 sites for colorectal, non-small cell lung cancer, as well as pancreatic cancer. What the company was actually able to do is run a 1B trial together with the phase 1A first-in-human clinical trial. So that immediately gave them savings in terms of time. They were permitted to revise the dosing schedule. So while they had to submit the revision in protocol, we conducted the ad hoc meetings with CROs, investigators to ensure that the changes were actually implemented efficiently. There were adaptations done over 4 years. You can see there were 15 protocol amendments, 14 cohorts, and more than 100 patients. But this was actually done together with the CRO. The CRO was able to implement these in its electronic data capture database. We did trainings on site for investigators as well as staff on the amended protocol to ensure that there was no loss in terms of learnings and implementation. And with that, we were able to ensure continued enrollment and data collection. The output was data, high-quality data that was accepted by the FDA for next stage applications. So you can see that from this, the company saved time because they were able to conduct trials in parallel. They were able to improve efficiency of the trial because they were able to look at the dosing schedule revisions and actually implement those protocols. And as an outcome, they were able to submit this data to the FDA and use it for the next stage of development. So which brings me then, when we talk about clinical trial data and quality, it brings me to the next section. So when we look at the quality of data that comes out from Australia, it is really world-class. As I mentioned, Australia is recognized as an excellent base of scientific and clinical research. It's historically well known. As we know, many of the world's blockbusters actually had origins of research in Australia. The government spends more than $3 billion a year to ensure that clinical research and Australia's medical infrastructure continues to be developed. The National Health and Medical Research Council also works to ensure that ethical policies and ethics are of international standards and are adhered within the scientific community. So when we look at the ecosystem in Australia, and what's interesting is this ecosystem is not just available in one place. It is available across the major cities, whether you're looking at Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, you'd have the similar ecosystem and excellent infrastructure that you can work with to ensure that you can do national level trials. So Australia has more than 40 international universities, some of which are linked to teaching hospitals, and many of whom have clinical research as their core foundation. There are also more than 50 independent medical research institutes that partner with these universities and teaching hospitals. And in addition to that, the biobanks that are available give a source for various types of clinical trials as well. The clinical trial networks, both local and international clinical trials are available, which are led by highly skilled clinicians and principal investigators. And the CRO industry in Australia is relatively mature. We've got a good number of solid CROs, well-trained, of international standards, and actually some are local CROs, and we've also got international CROs as well. So that base of availability and expertise is very, very strong. So when we look at the H index, which looks at productivity and impact of scientists within a country, we see that Australia comes up as one of the best countries globally, and the leading country actually in Asia-Pacific region from a H index perspective. So you see that the United States comes out at number 1, followed by UK and Germany. Australia actually comes in at 9th position, but it's in the top 10, ahead of Japan, China, and South Korea as well. So this looks that, you are working in a country that's actually top 10 in the world in terms of medical and clinical research. Secondly, which I think is a really important point as we look to ensure that our products are globally available, is that data output from Australian clinical studies can be used to support international regulatory applications. Both US as well as European EMEA applications can be supported with Australian data. When we combine that with the cost savings, we saw that the regulatory ease and time to actually get protocol approval and recruit patients and conduct trials, you have a tri-combination that enables you to efficiently and quickly bring products faster across the development stage. So Australia is internationally extremely efficient. It ensures that it complies to international standards. It's actually adapted from the International Conference on Harmonization, so ICH, ISO, are both well adopted in Australia. Australia also mandates good clinical practice across all trial sites, and that ensures that these are, again, of international standards. Furthermore, when we look at the TGA, that's actually mirrored along the European guidelines with some adaptation for local regulatory requirements. But what this does is it ensures easier integration when we're looking at working with Europe or US, because the standards that have been applied in Australia are similar to these Western standards. And finally, as we mentioned, data output and quality from studies conducted in Australia can be used to support international regulatory applications with FDA and EMEA. So you can see that when we spoke to certain companies in China, so this particular example, for Chinese companies who want to market their products internationally, it is important to have clinical trial data that is accepted by these international organizations. And hence, when you look at, you could do it in the US, you could do it in Europe, or you could do it in Australia. But as we've seen, we do have the competitiveness in Australia in terms of both pricing as well as timing. The other area, when we're looking at early stage R&D, IP is extremely important as well. We want to ensure that our products are protected from this perspective in our research. So when we look at the International Property Rights Index, you can see that Australia comes out 13th of 129 countries, so it's pretty high up there. The only other countries that are ahead in Asia Pacific is Japan. So this shows that it's very solid in terms of ensuring IP protection for our research that's being conducted there. Another example of a company that's actually successfully been able to conduct a trial in Australia and move ahead. This is for in the medical devices stage. So a clinical stage medical devices company, US-based company, was looking at developing non-pharmacologic devices for weight loss. What they actually needed to do was, to get data, obviously, for that procedure. So they conducted a phase 1 clinical trial with Novotech on 20 obese patients. This was led by a principal investigator from a leading hospital in Australia, the Prince of Wales Hospital, who's also a senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales. The ability of this principal investigator, we had the clinical expertise, there were facilities that were world-class, as well as access to the right patient group, quick access to the patient group actually contributed to the success of the trial. So in 6 months, the company was actually able to get positive findings on efficacy and safety of the product, and the phase 1 clinical trial was approved, as well as the TGA approved the CTN devices trial. So you can see the company was actually able to move very, very quickly to get the trial approval that they needed. So with those case studies, let's look at what companies actually look at when they are selecting a CRO. And these are things that you'd probably look out for as well. So we talked about the cost competitiveness that's clearly there in Australia. But I think beyond that, there are 3 very important points to ensure that the CRO you work with has got the right capabilities to support you. I think first of all is experience. We need to ensure that we're not working with a company that's experimenting or that's using our products or our data as a way to develop capabilities or develop experience. So really experience with regulatory audits, with foreign companies, experience working with smaller biotech companies as well, because it's quite different. The skill sets that you need, the way that you actually have to work with them is quite different from working with big pharma. And of course, experience in specific phases, because conducting clinical trials, whether it's early phase or phase 1 to a phase 3 trial, needs a different set of capabilities. In addition, the ability to understand regulatory requirements is important to ensure that we're able to move the product quickly through the research phases. So the team is crucial, a team that actually has got low turnover as well, because if you're in a project and you're constantly getting a new project manager, that doesn't do very well for your project. So a good, capable project manager and good, capable CRA, which are full-time in the company, so that you know that they are focusing on your product and your research. IT, as we move today into the world of technology and IT, we need to have processes and ways in which we can capture data and actually use that quickly and efficiently. And quality systems internally, whether it's standard operating procedures, the internal audits that are available, so you can always check. And if you have assessments that are coming in from regulatory authorities, you know that the CRO will be able to handle them. And I think the other important point is obviously the relationship, because you want them to have a relationship with lead investigators, with opinion leaders and institutions, so that you have the right people that are available to work on your product and on your research itself, with an international presence, because today we are all developing products for the world. So it could be a product developed in China or in Australia for this matter, but with the future perspective of being used in US, Europe, or anywhere else in the world. So, we spoke to some companies in terms of what they look for as well. And you can see, understanding of the space, the product space itself, the quality of work, the ability to work with smaller companies, as I mentioned, because it's quite different from working with big pharma, the right therapy area and the right experience in the trial phase, project management expertise, and CRA expertise as well, and also presence in multiple countries to enable you to conduct multi-country sites or actually launch in multiple countries. So in summary, why do we say that Australia is a preferred destination for early phase clinical trials? We've talked about the research environment. It's clear that Australia has a solid internationally recognized research environment and has been used as a world recognized destination for early phase clinical trials for a number of years. It's not just now. It is a skill set that has been developing over decades. It is a leader, as we saw, across dimensions of speed, quality, and cost, the three areas that are extremely important when we're doing clinical research. We talked about the fast regulatory and clinical trial process as well, and the competitive costs that you get with the quality coming with it. So the data and the international recognition of that data complements the speed and the cost that you get. The government is supportive, so you will see that the Australian government is looking at supporting Chinese companies to actually come into early stage clinical trial data. They're looking at further collaborations and partnerships between Australia and China, so you do have an environment that supports this. And based on that, we do see that Australia is a destination that could support Chinese companies in developing products for the world. So, we spoke to certain other companies that have had the experience of conducting early stage clinical trials with Novotech in Australia, and this is based on real life experience. So you can see, I recommend Chinese companies that want to expand internationally to conduct early phase clinical trials in Australia, because you get quality clinical trial data at less cost from the US, shorter time to start up, and take advantage of the tax incentive that Australia offers. So this is from the CFO of a Chinese-based pharmaceutical company that conducted a phase 1 clinical trial for its oncology product in Australia. So with that, in summary, we hope that that's given you some insights on what the environment is like in Australia and an option for you to consider in terms of your early stage clinical trials. Thank you very much.